49 Processes flow. Begin with top left of processes flow chart. The initiating phase. 4.1. Develop project charter. Develop project charter is the process of developing a document that formally authorizes the existence of a project and provides the project manager with the authority to apply organizational resources to project activities. The key benefits of this process are that it provides a direct link between the project and the strategic objectives of the organization, creates a formal record of the project, and shows the organizational commitment to the project. This process is performed once or at predefined points in the project. The inputs, tools and techniques, and outputs of the process are depicted in Figure 4.2. Figure 4.3 depicts the data flow diagram for the process. The project charter establishes a partnership between the performing and requesting organizations. In the case of external projects, a formal contract is typically the preferred way to establish an agreement. A project charter may still be used to establish internal agreements within an organization to ensure proper delivery under the contract. The approved project charter formally initiates the project. A project manager is identified and assigned as early in the project as is feasible, preferably while the project charter is being developed and always prior to the start of planning. The project charter can be developed by the sponsor or the project manager in collaboration with the initiating entity. This collaboration allows the project manager to have a better understanding of the project purpose, objectives, and expected benefits. This understanding will better allow for efficient resource allocation to project activities. The project charter provides the project manager with the authority to plan, execute, and control the project. Projects are initiated by an entity external to the project such as a sponsor, program, or project management office, PMO, or a portfolio governing body chairperson or authorized representative. The project initiator or sponsor should be at a level that is appropriate to procure funding and commit resources to the project. Projects are initiated due to internal business needs or external influences. These needs or influences often trigger the creation of a needs analysis, feasibility study, business case, or description of the situation that the project will address. Chartering a project validates alignment of the project to the strategy and ongoing work of the organization. A project charter is not considered to be a contract because there is no consideration or money promised or exchanged in its creation. Project stakeholder management includes the processes required to identify the people, groups, or organizations that could impact or be impacted by the project, to analyze stakeholder expectations and their impact on the project, and to develop appropriate management strategies for effectively engaging stakeholders in project decisions and execution. The processes support the work of the project team to analyze stakeholder expectations, assess the degree to which they impact or are impacted by the project, and develop strategies to effectively engage stakeholders in support of project decisions and the planning and execution of the work of the project. The project stakeholder management processes are: 13.1 Identify stakeholders. So the process of identifying project stakeholders regularly and analyzing and documenting relevant information regarding their interests, involvement, interdependencies, influence, and potential impact on project success. Key concepts for project stakeholder management. Every project has stakeholders who are impacted by or can impact the project in a positive or negative way. Some stakeholders may have a limited ability to influence the project's work or outcomes. Others may have significant influence on the project and its expected outcomes. Academic research and analyses of high-profile project disasters highlight the importance of a structured approach to the identification, prioritization, and engagement of all stakeholders. The ability of the project manager and team to correctly identify and engage all stakeholders in an appropriate way can mean the difference between project success and failure. To increase the chances of success, the process of stakeholder identification and engagement should commence as soon as possible after the project charter has been approved, the project manager has been assigned and the team begins to form. 13.1 Identify stakeholders. Identify stakeholders is the process of identifying project stakeholders regularly and analyzing and documenting relevant information regarding their interests, involvement, interdependencies, influence, and potential impact on project success. The key benefit of this process is that it enables the project team to identify the appropriate focus for engagement of each stakeholder or group of stakeholders. This process is performed periodically throughout the project as needed. The inputs, tools and techniques, and outputs of the process are depicted in Figure 13.2. Figure 13.3 depicts the data flow diagram for the process. This process frequently occurs for the first time in a project either prior to or at the same time the project charter is developed and approved. It is repeated as necessary, but should be performed at the start of each phase and when a significant change in the project or the organization occurs. Each time the identification process is repeated, the project management plan components and project documents should be consulted to identify relevant project stakeholders. End of the initiating phase. Begin the planning phase. 3.1 Develop Project Management Plan. Develop Project Management Plan is the process of defining, preparing, and coordinating all plan components and consolidating them into an integrated project management plan. The key benefit of this process is the production of a comprehensive document that defines the basis of all project work and how the work will be performed. This process is performed once or at predefined points in the project. The inputs and outputs of this process are depicted in Figure 3.2. The needs of the project determine which components of the project management plan and which project documents are necessary. 3.2 Plan Scope Management. Plan scope management is the process of creating a scope management plan that documents how the project and product scope will be defined, validated, and controlled. The key benefit of this process is that it provides guidance and direction on how scope will be managed throughout the project. This process is performed once or at predefined points in the project. The inputs and outputs of this process are depicted in Figure 3.3. The needs of the project determine which components of the project management plan are necessary. 3.3 Collect requirements. Collect requirements is the process of determining, documenting, and managing stakeholder needs and requirements to meet objectives. The key benefit of this process is that it provides the basis for defining the product scope and project scope. This process is performed once or at predefined points in the project. The inputs and outputs of this process are depicted in Figure 3.4. The needs of the project determine which components of the project management plan and which project documents are necessary. 3.4 Define scope. Define scope is the process of developing a detailed description of the project and product. The key benefit of this process is that it describes the product, service, or result boundaries and acceptance criteria. This process is performed once or at predefined points in the project. The inputs and outputs of this process are depicted in Figure 3.5. The needs of the project determine which components of the project management plan and which project documents are necessary. 3.5 Create WBS. Create Work Breakdown Structure. WBS is the process of subdividing project deliverables and project work into smaller, more manageable components. The key benefit of this process is that it provides a framework of what has to be delivered. This process is performed once or at predefined points in the project. The inputs and outputs of this process are depicted in Figure 3.6. The needs of the project determine which components of the project management plan and which project documents are necessary. 3.6 Plan Schedule Management. Plan schedule management is the process of establishing the policies, procedures, and documentation for planning, developing, managing, executing, and controlling the project schedule. The key benefit of this process is that it provides guidance and direction on how the project schedule will be managed throughout the project. This process is performed once or at predefined points in the project. The inputs and outputs of this process are depicted in Figure 3.7. The needs of the project determine which components of the project management plan are necessary. 3.7 Define activities. Define activities is the process of identifying and documenting the specific actions to be performed to produce the project deliverables. The key benefit of this process is that it decomposes work packages into schedule activities that provide a basis for estimating, scheduling, executing, monitoring, and controlling the project work. This process is performed throughout the project. The inputs and outputs of this process are depicted in Figure 3.8. The needs of the project determine which components of the project management plan are necessary. 3.8 Sequence activities. Sequence activities is the process of identifying and documenting relationships among the project activities. The key benefit of this process is that it defines the logical sequence of work to obtain the greatest efficiency given all project constraints. This process is performed throughout the project. The inputs and outputs of this process are depicted in Figure 3.9. The needs of the project determine which components of the project management plan and which project documents are necessary. 3.9 Estimate activity durations. Estimate activity durations is the process of estimating the number of work periods needed to complete individual activities with estimated resources. The key benefit of this process is that it provides the amount of time each activity will take to complete. This process is performed throughout the project. The inputs and outputs of this process are depicted in Figure 310. 3.10 Develop Schedule. Develop schedule is the process of analyzing activity sequences, durations, resource requirements, and schedule constraints to create a schedule model for project execution and the monitoring and controlling. The key benefit of this process is that it generates a schedule model with planned dates for completing project activities. This process is performed throughout the project. The inputs and outputs of this process are depicted in Figure 311. The needs of the project determine which components of the project management plan and which project documents are necessary. Top left of 49 processes flowchart completed. Begin top right of 49 processes flowchart. The planning phase. 3.11 Plan Cost Management. Plan cost management is the process of defining how the project costs will be estimated, budgeted, managed, monitored, and controlled. The key benefit of this process is that it provides guidance and direction on how the project costs will be managed throughout the project. This process is performed once, or at predefined points in the project. The inputs and outputs of this process are depicted in Figure 312. 3.12 Estimate Costs. Estimate costs is the process of developing an approximation of the monetary resources needed to complete project work. The key benefit of this process is that it determines the monetary resources required for the project. This process is performed periodically throughout the project as needed. The inputs and outputs of this process are depicted in Figure 313. 3.13 Determine Budget. Determine budget is the process of aggregating the estimated costs of individual activities or work packages to establish an authorized cost baseline. The key benefit of this process is that it determines the cost baseline against which project performance can be monitored and controlled. This process is performed once or at predefined points in the project. The inputs and outputs of this process are depicted in Figure 314. 3.14 Plan Quality Management. Plan quality management is the process of identifying quality requirements and/or standards for the project and its deliverables, and documenting how the project will demonstrate compliance with quality requirements and/or standards. The key benefit of this process is that it provides guidance and direction on how quality will be managed and verified throughout the project. This process is performed once or at predefined points in the project. The inputs and outputs of this process are shown in Figure 315. 3.15 Plan Resource Management. Plan resource management is the process of defining how to estimate, acquire, manage, and utilize physical and team resources. The key benefit of this process is that it establishes the approach and level of management effort needed for managing project resources based on the type and complexity of the project. This process is performed once or at predefined points in the project. The inputs and outputs of this process are shown in Figure 316. 3.16 Estimate Activity Resources. Estimate activity resources is the process of estimating team resources and the type and quantities of materials, equipment, and supplies necessary to perform project work. The key benefit of this process is that it identifies the type, quantity, and characteristics of resources required to complete the project. This process is performed periodically throughout the project as needed. The inputs and outputs of this process are depicted in Figure 317. 3.17 Plan Communications Management. Plan communications management is the process of developing an appropriate approach and plan for project communication activities based on the information needs of each stakeholder or group, available organizational assets, and the needs of the project. The key benefit of this process is a documented approach to effectively and efficiently engage stakeholders by presenting relevant information in a timely manner. This process is performed periodically throughout the project as needed. The inputs and outputs of this process are depicted in Figure 318. Top right of the 49 processes flowchart completed. Begin bottom right half of the processes flowchart. 11.1 Plan Risk Management. Plan risk management is the process of defining how to conduct risk management activities for a project. The key benefit of this process is that it ensures that the degree, type, and visibility of risk management are proportionate to both risks and the importance of the project to the organization and other stakeholders. This process is performed once or at predefined points in the project. The inputs, tools and techniques, and outputs of the process are depicted in Figure 11.2. Figure 11.3 depicts the data flow diagram for the process. The plan risk management process should begin when a project is conceived and should be completed early in the project. It may be necessary to revisit this process later in the project life cycle, for example at a major phase change, or if the project scope changes significantly, or if a subsequent review of risk management effectiveness determines that the project risk management process requires modification. 11.2 Identify risks. Identify risks is the process of identifying individual project risks as well as sources of overall project risk, and documenting their characteristics. The key benefit of this process is the documentation of existing individual project risks and the sources of overall project risk. It also brings together information so the project team can respond appropriately to identified risks. This process is performed throughout the project. The inputs, tools and techniques, and outputs of the process are depicted in Figure 11.6. Figure 11.7 depicts the data flow diagram for the process. Identify risks considers both individual project risks and sources of overall project risk. Participants in risk identification activities may include the following: project manager, project team members, project risk specialist, if assigned, customers, subject matter experts from outside the project team, end users, other project managers, operations managers, stakeholders, and risk management experts within the organization. While these personnel are often key participants for risk identification, all project stakeholders should be encouraged to identify individual project risks. It is particularly important to involve the project team so they can develop and maintain a sense of ownership and responsibility for identified individual project risks, the level of overall project risk, and associated risk response actions. When describing and recording individual project risks, a consistent format should be used for risk statements to ensure that each risk is understood clearly and unambiguously in order to support effective analysis and risk response development. Risk owners for individual project risks may be nominated as part of the Identify Risks process, and will be confirmed during the Perform Qualitative Risk Analysis process. Preliminary risk responses may also be identified and recorded and will be reviewed and confirmed as part of the Plan Risk Responses process. Identify risks is an iterative process, since new individual project risks may emerge as the project progresses through its life cycle and the level of overall project risk will also change. The frequency of iteration and participation in each risk identification cycle will vary by situation, and this will be defined in the risk management plan. 11.3 Perform Qualitative Risk Analysis. Perform qualitative risk analysis is the process of prioritizing individual project risks for further analysis or action by assessing their probability of occurrence and impact as well as other characteristics. The key benefit of this process is that it focuses efforts on high-priority risks. This process is performed throughout the project. The inputs, tools and techniques, and outputs of the process are depicted in Figure 11.8. Figure 11.9 depicts the data flow diagram for the process. Perform qualitative risk analysis assesses the priority of identified individual project risks using their probability of occurrence, the corresponding impact on project objectives if the risks occur, and other factors. Such assessments are subjective as they are based on perceptions of risk by the project team and other stakeholders. Effective assessment therefore requires explicit identification and management of the risk attitudes of key participants in the Perform Qualitative Risk Analysis process. Risk perception introduces bias into the assessment of identified risks, so attention should be paid to identifying bias and correcting for it. Where a facilitator is used to support the Perform Qualitative Risk Analysis process, addressing bias is a key part of the facilitator's role. An evaluation of the quality of the available information on individual project risks also helps to clarify the assessment of each risk's importance to the project. Perform qualitative risk analysis establishes the relative priorities of individual project risks for plan risk responses. It identifies a risk owner for each risk who will take responsibility for planning an appropriate risk response and ensuring that it is implemented. Perform qualitative risk analysis also lays the foundation for perform quantitative risk analysis if this process is required. The Perform Qualitative Risk Analysis process is performed regularly throughout the project life cycle, as defined in the Risk Management Plan. Often, in an agile development environment, the Perform Qualitative Risk Analysis process is conducted before the start of each iteration. 11.4 Perform Quantitative Risk Analysis. Perform quantitative risk analysis is the process of numerically analyzing the combined effect of identified individual project risks and other sources of uncertainty on overall project objectives. The key benefit of this process is that it quantifies overall project risk exposure, and it can also provide additional quantitative risk information to support risk response planning. This process is not required for every project, but where it is used, it is performed throughout the project. The inputs and outputs of this process are depicted in Figure 11.11. Figure 11.12 depicts the data flow diagram for the process. Perform quantitative risk analysis is not required for all projects. Undertaking a robust analysis depends on the availability of high-quality data about individual project risks and other sources of uncertainty, as well as a sound underlying project baseline for scope, schedule, and cost. Quantitative risk analysis usually requires specialized risk software and expertise in the development and interpretation of risk models. It also consumes additional time and cost. The use of quantitative risk analysis for a project will be specified in the project's risk management plan. It is most likely appropriate for large or complex projects, strategically important projects, projects for which it is a contractual requirement, or projects in which a key stakeholder requires it. Quantitative risk analysis is the only reliable method to assess overall project risk through evaluating the aggregated effect on project outcomes of all individual project risks and other sources of uncertainty. Perform quantitative risk analysis uses information on individual project risks that have been assessed by the performed qualitative risk analysis process as having a significant potential to affect the project's objectives. Outputs from performed quantitative risk analysis are used as inputs to the plan risk responses process, particularly in recommending responses to the level of overall project risk and key individual risks. A quantitative risk analysis may also be undertaken following the plan risk responses process, to determine the likely effectiveness of planned responses in reducing overall project risk exposure. 3.22 Plan risk responses. Plan risk responses is the process of developing options, selecting strategies, and agreeing on actions to address overall project risk exposure as well as to treat individual project risks. The key benefit of this process is that it identifies appropriate ways to address overall project risk and individual project risks. This process also allocates resources and inserts activities into project documents and the project management plan as needed. This process is performed throughout the project. The inputs and outputs of this process are depicted in Figure 3.23. 3.23 Plan procurement management. Plan procurement management is the process of documenting project procurement decisions, specifying the approach, and identifying potential sellers. The key benefit of this process is that it determines whether to acquire goods and services from outside the project and, if so, what to acquire as well as how and when to acquire it. Goods and services may be procured from other parts of the performing organization or from external sources. This process is performed once or at predefined points in the project. The inputs and outputs of this process are depicted in Figure 3.24. 3.24 Plan stakeholder engagement. Plan stakeholder engagement is the process of developing approaches to involve project stakeholders based on their needs, expectations, interests, and potential impact on the project. The key benefit is that it provides an actionable plan to interact with stakeholders effectively. This process is performed periodically throughout the project as needed. The inputs and outputs of this process are depicted in Figure 3.25. Moving over to the executing phase. Bottom left of the chart. 4.1 Direct and manage project work. Direct and manage project work is the process of leading and performing the work defined in the project management plan and implementing approved changes to achieve the project's objectives. The key benefit of this process is that it provides overall management of the project work and deliverables, thus improving the probability of project success. This process is performed throughout the project. The inputs and outputs of this process are depicted in Figure 4.2. 4.2 Manage project knowledge. Manage project knowledge is the process of using existing knowledge and creating new knowledge to achieve the project's objectives and contribute to organizational learning. The key benefits of this process are that prior organizational knowledge is leveraged to produce or improve the project outcomes and that knowledge created by the project is available to support organizational operations and future projects or phases. This process is performed throughout the project. The inputs and outputs of this process are depicted in Figure 4.3. 4.3 Manage quality. Manage quality is the process of translating the quality management plan into executable quality activities that incorporate the organization's quality policies into the project. The key benefit of this process is that it increases the probability of meeting the quality objectives, as well as identifying ineffective processes and causes of poor quality. This process is performed throughout the project. The inputs and outputs of this process are shown in Figure 4.4. 4.6 Manage Team. Manage Team is the process of tracking team member performance, providing feedback, resolving issues, and managing team changes to optimize project performance. The key benefit of this process is that it influences team behavior, manages conflict, and resolves issues. This process is performed throughout the project. The inputs and outputs of this process are shown in Figure 4.7. 4.7 Manage Communications. Manage Communications is the process of ensuring timely and appropriate collection, creation, distribution, storage, retrieval, management, monitoring, and the ultimate disposition of project information. The key benefit of this process is that it enables an efficient and effective information flow between the project team and the stakeholders. This process is performed throughout the project. The inputs and outputs of this process are depicted in Figure 4.8. 4.8 Implement Risk Responses. Implement risk responses is the process of implementing agreed-upon risk response plans. The key benefit of this process is that it ensures that agreed-upon risk responses are executed as planned in order to address overall project risk exposure, as well as to minimize individual project threats and maximize individual project opportunities. This process is performed throughout the project. The inputs and outputs of this process are depicted in Figure 4.9. 4.9 Conduct Procurements. Conduct procurements is the process of obtaining seller responses, selecting a seller, and awarding a contract. The key benefit of this process is that it selects a qualified seller and implements the legal agreement for delivery. This process is performed periodically throughout the project as needed. The inputs and outputs of this process are depicted in Figure 4.10. 4.10 Manage Stakeholder Engagement. Manage stakeholder engagement is the process of communicating and working with stakeholders to meet their needs and expectations, address issues, and foster appropriate stakeholder involvement. The key benefit of this process is that it allows the project manager to increase support and minimize resistance from stakeholders. This process is performed throughout the project. The inputs and outputs of this process are depicted in Figure 4.11. That completes the executing phase. Begin monitoring and controlling phase. 5.1 Monitor and control project work. Monitor and control project work is the process of tracking, reviewing, and reporting the overall progress to meet the performance objectives defined in the project management plan. The key benefit of this process is that it allows stakeholders to understand the current state of the project, to recognize the actions taken to address any performance issues, and to have visibility into the future project status with cost and schedule forecasts. This process is performed throughout the project. The inputs and outputs for this process are depicted in Figure 5.2. 5.2 Perform Integrated Change Control. Perform Integrated Change Control is the process of reviewing all change requests, approving changes and managing changes to deliverables, organizational process assets, project documents, and the project management plan, and communicating the decisions. This process reviews all requests for changes to project documents, deliverables, or the project management plan, and determines the resolution of the change requests. The key benefit of this process is that it allows for documented changes within the project to be considered in an integrated manner while addressing overall project risk, which often arises from changes made without consideration of the overall project objectives or plans. This process is performed throughout the project. The inputs and outputs of this process are depicted in Figure 5.3. 5.3 Validate Scope. Validate Scope is the process of formalizing acceptance of the completed project deliverables. The key benefit of this process is that it brings objectivity to the acceptance process and increases the probability of final product, service, or result acceptance by validating each deliverable. This process is performed periodically throughout the project as needed. The inputs and outputs of this process are depicted in Figure 5.4. 5.4 Control Scope. Control scope is the process of monitoring the status of the project and product scope and managing changes to the scope baseline. The key benefit of this process is that the scope baseline is maintained throughout the project. This process is performed throughout the project. The inputs and outputs of this process are depicted in Figure 5.5. 5.5 Control Schedule. Control schedule is the process of monitoring the status of the project to update the project schedule and manage changes to the schedule baseline. The key benefit of this process is that the schedule baseline is maintained throughout the project. This process is performed throughout the project. The inputs and outputs of this process are depicted in Figure 5.6. 5.6 Control Costs. Control costs is the process of monitoring the status of the project to update the project costs and managing changes to the cost baseline. The key benefit of this process is that the cost baseline is maintained throughout the project. This process is performed throughout the project. The inputs and outputs of this process are depicted in Figure 5.7. 5.7 Control Quality. Control quality is the process of monitoring and recording results of executing the quality management activities to assess performance and ensure the project outputs are complete, correct, and meet customer expectations. The key benefit of this process is verifying that project deliverables and work meet the requirements specified by key stakeholders for final acceptance. This process is performed throughout the project. The inputs and outputs of this process are shown in Figure 5.8. 5.8 Control Resources. Control resources is the process of ensuring that the physical resources assigned and allocated to the project are available as planned, as well as monitoring the planned versus actual utilization of resources and taking corrective action as necessary. The key benefit of this process is ensuring that the assigned resources are available to the project at the right time and in the right place and are released when no longer needed. This process is performed throughout the project. The inputs and outputs of this process are shown in Figure 5.9. 5.9 Monitor Communications. Monitor communications is the process of ensuring the information needs of the project and its stakeholders are met. The key benefit of this process is the optimal information flow as defined in the Communications Management Plan and Stakeholder Engagement Plan. This process is performed throughout the project. The inputs and outputs of this process are depicted in Figure 5.10. 5.10 Monitor Risks. Monitor risks is the process of monitoring the implementation of agreed-upon risk response plans, tracking identified risks, identifying and analyzing new risks, and evaluating risk process effectiveness throughout the project. The key benefit of this process is that it enables project decisions to be based on current information about overall project risk exposure and individual project risks. This process is performed throughout the project. The inputs and outputs of this process are depicted in Figure 5.11. 5.11 Control Procurements. Control procurements is the process of managing procurement relationships, monitoring contract performance and making changes and corrections as appropriate, and closing out contracts. The key benefit of this process is that it ensures that both the seller's and buyer's performance meets the project's requirements according to the terms of the legal agreements. This process is performed throughout the project, when procurements are active. The inputs and outputs of this process are depicted in Figure 5.12. 5.12 Monitor Stakeholder Engagement. Monitor stakeholder engagement is the process of monitoring project stakeholder relationships, and tailoring strategies for engaging stakeholders through modification of engagement strategies and plans. The key benefit of this process is that it maintains or increases the efficiency and effectiveness of stakeholder engagement activities as the project evolves and its environment changes. This process is performed throughout the project. The inputs and outputs of this process are depicted in Figure 5.13. Monitoring and controlling phase completed.